The morning had a fragile stillness to it, the kind that whispers secrets to those who are quiet enough to listen. Sunlight sliced through the half-open blinds, brushing against the old wooden floor with soft, golden streaks. I stood by the kitchen window, a mug of coffee clasped in my hand, watching as the dew-dappled grass glistened under the early light. I should have felt calm, but an inexplicable unease curled deep in my chest. Molly was busy, as usual. The clinking of dishes and the sound of running water filled the room as she moved, her back to me, long hair tied in a messy bun that barely swayed with her hurried steps. She always had that way about her, efficient, beautiful, and just a bit distracted. But lately, there was more than distraction. There was distance. "Going out tonight," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. She turned around, leaning casually against the kitchen island, coffee in one hand, eyes cool and steady. "Going out?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. "With friends?" She shifted, her gaze flitting to the window behind me, then back. "Yeah, with friends," she replied, too quickly. She didn't need to say more, her eyes said it all, guarded and far away, like someone watching a storm approach from a safe distance. I nodded slowly, feeling a familiar tightness coil around my gut. We were 12 years into this marriage, bound by countless shared memories, the spontaneous road trips, the winter mornings with whispered promises, the late-night arguments resolved by shared laughter. But today, that thread felt frayed, almost imaginary. The day passed with the monotony of routine. Work calls, emails, the hum of a printer somewhere in the house. But beneath it, something relentless gnawed at me. I replayed the mornings, the sudden absences, the way she laughed less and checked her phone more. It felt like watching a train slip off the tracks in slow motion, powerless to stop it. By the time dusk settled, Molly emerged from the bedroom in a fitted red dress that clung to her like a secret. I swallowed hard, pushing down the surge of questions that threatened to break free. "Don't wait up," she said, pausing by the front door. The softness in her voice only deepened the silence after she left. The house seemed to exhale around me, heavy with echoes and absences. I stood for a moment, staring at the closed door, before turning on my heel and heading to the garage. It was more than a place for tools and forgotten projects. It had become my refuge, the one place I could think without the weight of unsaid words pressing down on me. Boxes stacked in dusty corners, old suitcases covered in a fine layer of neglect. I didn't even know what I was looking for, maybe a distraction, maybe a clue. My fingers grazed the worn leather of one suitcase and stopped. It was hers. I'd seen it before on some of her many work trips, but hadn't given it much thought until now. Heart thudding, I unlatched the clasps and opened it. Inside was a jumble of small trinkets, keychains, postcards, tiny souvenirs with the names of cities we hadn't visited together. Orlando, Houston, Chicago. I picked up a magnet that read Orlando, where memories are made, and felt a sharp chill run down my spine. Molly's job as a project coordinator didn't involve trips to these places, at least not one she had mentioned. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as desert sand. The realization began to crystallize, each piece falling into place with a cruel click. She had been hiding parts of her life, secret fragments neatly tucked away between our shared days. A noise outside jolted me from my thoughts. The soft rumble of an engine, tires crunching over the gravel driveway. The clock on the garage wall read past midnight. I shoved the souvenirs back into the suitcase and shut it, the snap of the latch echoing in the dark. When I met Molly at the front door, she wore the aftermath of her evening like a second skin, flushed cheeks, a faint smile, eyes that avoided mine. I stood there, an apology forming on my tongue for an accusation I hadn't made yet. But she brushed past me, her perfume leaving a trail of roses and guilt. "Good night," she whispered, almost absent-mindedly. I nodded, the simple action feeling like a betrayal to myself. As she disappeared down the hallway, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, I knew tonight had changed something. A curtain had been lifted, exposing a reality I wasn't sure I was prepared to face. I waited until the house was silent again before opening my laptop, my fingers shaking as they hovered over the keyboard. Passwords shared in trust. a decade's worth of faith pressed into keys. I began to search, the bright screen illuminating my face as message after message unfurled like a silent confession. The name that surfaced again and again? Jeremy. Each word between them was a knife, casual and lethal. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing leaves against the windows with whispers of old secrets. I closed the laptop and sat back, the room spinning around me. There was no going back. This was the night that changed everything, and I knew that the days ahead would carve scars into both of us that we'd carry forever. But tonight, I felt only the cold resolve of someone betrayed, someone waiting for the storm to come. Morning brought a heavy stillness, the kind that feels suffocating, like the room is pressing in on itself. Molly was already up, moving through the house with the practiced ease of someone comfortable in their own deception. I could hear the clatter of pots and the hiss of running water from the kitchen. The familiar sound felt foreign now, like I was listening to a stranger's morning routine. I pushed myself out of bed, the weight of my discovery still pressing on my chest. My eyes fell on the closed laptop on the desk, a silent witness to last night's revelation. The name Jeremy echoed in my mind like an unwelcome guest, occupying every corner of my thoughts. My fists clenched involuntarily as flashes of their exchanged words surfaced, lines soaked with flirtation and familiarity. My mind raced, each memory of Molly's late-night work trips replaying with a new, sickening clarity. When I walked into the kitchen, she was there, dressed casually in an old t-shirt and jeans, her hair still damp from the shower. She turned, and for a moment, our eyes met. There was something there, a glimmer of uncertainty before her smile kicked in, polished and bright. "Good morning," she said, the cheer in her voice hitting my ears like nails. "Morning," I replied, fighting to keep my voice steady. I took a seat at the table, watching her move around the kitchen with a practiced ease. The mundane normalcy of it all made my stomach churn. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, her back to me as she reached for the coffee pot. "Not really," I said, the edge in my voice sharper than I intended. She paused, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. I knew she felt it. "Oh?" She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes searching mine. "Something on your mind?" I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of the question. My jaw tightened, and I forced myself to look away, staring out the window at the dew-dappled grass, pretending the glistening drops were enough to hold my attention. "Work," I muttered. It was a lie, but it was easier than the truth. The truth would crack open everything between us, and I wasn't ready, not yet. The day dragged like a heavy anchor, each moment weighed down by the burden of knowing. Molly's laugh, her small touches as she walked past, the way she hummed while folding laundry, each detail became part of the intricate play she'd built to keep me blind. But I wasn't blind anymore. My eyes were open, and they stung from the light. I waited until she left for her afternoon run, watched as she stretched at the end of the driveway, oblivious to the storm brewing behind the window where I stood. The moment she rounded the corner, I grabbed my phone and laptop. It was time to dig deeper. The texts between Molly and Jeremy were just the tip of the iceberg. I knew there was more. I started with the credit card statements. Over the years, I'd barely given them more than a glance. We had a system, she handled her expenses, I handled mine, and we split the bills. But now, each line item became a breadcrumb leading to something deeper. Dinner charges at restaurants I'd never heard of, hotel stays that didn't line up with her business trips, high-end boutique purchases made on days when I remembered her complaining about working late. The knots in my stomach tightened with every new discovery. It wasn't just the betrayal itself, it was the meticulous care she'd taken to hide it. It painted her not as someone who stumbled into a mistake but as someone who carefully crafted a double life. The thought made my skin crawl. The front door opened, and I snapped my laptop shut. Molly's footsteps echoed in the hall, slow and measured. "Hey," she said, leaning against the doorframe, a towel around her neck and beads of sweat dotting her temples. "What are you up to?" "Nothing," I lied, hoping my voice sounded casual. "Just going over some work stuff." She nodded, her expression unreadable. For a moment, there was silence, the kind that's thick and suffocating, where both people are waiting for the other to speak. Then she walked into the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water before disappearing down the hallway. I waited until I heard the shower turn on before exhaling, the tension leaving my body in a shudder. Hours bled into evening, and the house settled into its usual rhythm. We sat at the dinner table, exchanging pleasantries, discussing plans for the weekend. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at it with the slightest flicker of guilt. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to stay composed. "Work?" I asked, feigning interest as I took a sip of water. "Yeah," she said, too quickly. She set the phone face down on the table and met my eyes. "Nothing important." Her voice was steady, but I could hear the crack, subtle but there. It was the sound of someone holding on too tightly to a lie. I nodded, a small, knowing smile pulling at the corners of my lips. After dinner, I stood at the sink, washing dishes as Molly moved to the living room, her attention caught by the television. I glanced over my shoulder, watching her silhouette framed against the soft glow of the screen. This was the woman I'd married, the woman I'd shared more than a decade with. But she felt like a stranger now, a version of Molly I didn't recognize. A sudden surge of resolve hardened my thoughts. I wasn't going to play the role of the clueless husband any longer. Tomorrow, I would confront her, but not without one final step. I needed proof that couldn't be dismissed, a way to ensure that when she saw the cards in my hand, she knew the game was over. That night, I installed a tracking app on her phone, the same one she had carelessly left charging on the nightstand. It synced to mine seamlessly, the tiny icon disappearing into the background, unseen. I felt a pang of guilt, but it was fleeting. Whatever trust we'd shared was already shattered, this was just the final hammer blow. I slipped into bed beside her, the space between us a gulf. She turned in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible, her arm brushing against mine. I stared at the ceiling, counting the minutes until dawn, the rhythmic rise and fall of her breathing a cruel reminder of how easily she slept while my world unraveled. Morning couldn't come soon enough. The morning sunlight streamed through the blinds, cutting through the bedroom in sharp beams that felt almost accusatory. Molly was still asleep, her breathing deep and rhythmic. I lay beside her, eyes wide open, the weight of the previous night's decisions pressing on my chest like an iron. The tracking app on my phone hummed quietly, a silent sentinel of secrets yet to be unveiled. I slipped out of bed without waking her and padded to the kitchen, the cold tiles biting at my feet. The house was still, and for a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. But everything had. I stared at my phone, the app icon almost mocking me with its small, innocuous presence. With a quick tap, I brought up her location history. She hadn't gone far last night, just to a part of town known for its upscale restaurants and boutique hotels. The timeline matched the charges I'd found on her credit card. My breath caught as I imagined her there, wrapped in someone else's attention, while I sat alone, blind to the truth. The app showed her current location, home, with me. The knowledge was as bitter as it was necessary. Molly appeared at the kitchen doorway, her hair tousled and eyes still half-lidded with sleep. "You're up early," she murmured, wrapping her robe tighter around her. "Couldn't sleep," I said, keeping my voice steady. I gestured to the coffee pot, which was sputtering and gurgling as it brewed. "Coffee?" "Thanks," she said, moving closer. She placed a hand on my shoulder, a casual touch that once would have been reassuring. Now it felt foreign, intrusive. We stood there for a moment, the kitchen bathed in early morning light, the silence between us taut. She glanced at me, eyes searching, but I kept my expression neutral. "Anything planned for today?" she asked, sipping from her mug. "Just work," I said, not meeting her gaze. I knew I needed to keep things normal for just a bit longer. The confrontation would come tonight, and I needed every piece of evidence to be undeniable. A text buzzed on her phone, sitting on the counter beside her. She picked it up and glanced at the screen, her face tightening for just a split second before she put it back down. "Everything okay?" I asked, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. "Yeah, just something from the office," she said, eyes darting to the side as she took another sip. Her calm was cracking, and I could see it in the way her fingers tapped against her mug, a subtle, rhythmic betrayal. The day unfolded in slow, excruciating minutes. I worked from my home office, surrounded by blueprints and mock-ups that now seemed trivial. My mind was somewhere else, skipping ahead to the evening, rehearsing what I would say and how she would respond. Every few minutes, I'd check the app. Her movements were predictable: a visit to the gym, a stop at a cafe she frequented, then back home. By evening, the anticipation had built to a fever pitch. Molly was in the living room, curled up with a book, looking so deceptively serene that for a moment, I questioned everything. But then the memory of those texts, the hotel bills, and the whispered laughter that wasn't mine hardened my resolve. "Hey, can we talk?" I said, standing at the edge of the room. My voice cut through the quiet, and she looked up, eyes widening a fraction. "Of course," she said, closing her book and placing it on the coffee table. The casualness of her movements, the way she settled into the couch, made something snap inside me. I sat across from her, the coffee table a battlefield of space between us. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. I didn't know where to start, so I took my phone out and set it on the table, screen up, the tracking app still open. "I know, Molly," I said, my voice low and even. Her brows furrowed. "Know what?" "About Jeremy," I said, the name leaving a metallic taste in my mouth. It was the first time I'd said it aloud, and it landed in the room like a grenade. Molly's face fell, the color draining from her cheeks. For a moment, she looked like she might deny it, might weave another story to cover the jagged edges of truth. But then her shoulders slumped, and she looked away, eyes fixed on the pattern of the rug. "How long?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and exhaustion. She took a shaky breath, fingers lacing and unlacing in her lap. "Almost a year," she whispered. "It didn't start like that. It was just talking. We were friends, and then." I held up a hand, stopping her. I didn't want to hear the details, the justifications, the inevitable. It meant nothing that cheaters always seem to cling to. My throat felt tight, and I struggled to swallow the lump that had formed there. "Do you know how humiliating it is?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "To realize you've been living in a lie, that you're the last to know your own life?" "I'm sorry, Thomas," she said, tears gathering in her eyes. But the apology felt hollow, a word dressed up as remorse. "Sorry isn't enough," I said, the steel in my tone making her flinch. "I found the hotel receipts, Molly. I read the texts. The dinners, the trips, everything you thought you were hiding so well." She opened her mouth to speak but closed it again, defeated. The room felt suffocating, the weight of her betrayal pressing in from all sides. "I trusted you," I said, the words carrying all the pain I felt, all the disbelief. "We built a life together, and you just tore it apart." Tears spilled over her cheeks, but I felt no sympathy, just a cold satisfaction that she couldn't hide behind any more lies. The silence that followed was louder than any argument we could have had, an emptiness that reverberated through the room. "I need time," I said, finally standing, "to figure out what comes next." She reached out, but I stepped back. The gesture, so desperate, almost made me pause, but I turned away and walked down the hall. The door to my office closed behind me with a finality that left me gasping for air. The confrontation was over, but the battle had only just begun. The days after the confrontation moved with a painful slowness, each moment stretching into the next, saturated with tension. Molly and I circled each other in silence, two planets caught in the gravity of shared betrayal. I slept in the guest room, the bed cold and unfamiliar, the nights long and hollow. Even though the confrontation had left us both exposed, nothing felt resolved. If anything, the wound had only deepened, raw and festering. One evening, a week after our conversation, Molly approached me in the kitchen. She was pale, dark shadows smudged beneath her eyes, her hair pulled back tightly as if it was the only thing holding her together. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice small, like a whisper trying not to break. I sighed, setting down the dish I'd been washing. The water ran in the background, a steady hiss that filled the silence between us. "What is there left to say?" Everything, she said, stepping closer. I need you to understand why. I met her gaze, and for the first time, I saw not defiance or fear, but an aching regret that made my breath catch. Understanding won't change anything, Molly, I said, but the exhaustion in my voice belied my words. I know, she admitted. But it's not just about us anymore. Her eyes flitted downward, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles turned white. There's something else. The words hung in the air, sharp and trembling. The silence that followed was like a gasp held too long. What do you mean? I managed, dread pooling in my stomach. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It shook as she handed it to me. I opened it, the words blurring for a moment before coming into focus. Test results. A name at the top, Jeremy. And beneath it, a series of numbers that meant nothing to me except for one, positive. What is this? My voice was sharp, barely controlled. It's why I ended it with him, she said, her voice breaking. He tested positive for ALS. It started months ago, and he didn't tell me until it was too late. I couldn't let it continue. Shock washed over me in waves. ALS, an incurable disease, slow and cruel. My hands trembled as I set the paper down. So you left him because of this? Yes, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I had to. But it's not just that, Thomas. I'm scared. The fear in her eyes was something I hadn't seen before. It was raw, unguarded. Why? She looked down, her lips parting but no words coming out. Then, barely audible, she said, because I might have it too. The room spun. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, the weight of the revelation crushing me. What? The word escaped, hollow and disbelieving. I've been feeling it, tingling in my hands, weakness in my legs. I thought it was stress at first, but I got tested. I'm still waiting for the results. The silence that followed was suffocating. I looked at her, this woman who had betrayed me, whose lies had fractured our life. But now, all I saw was the person I had loved for 12 years, terrified and vulnerable. My anger, so fierce and all-consuming before, faltered. It wasn't gone, but it was buried beneath the shock, the cruel twist of fate that made betrayal seem almost irrelevant. I turned away, gripping the counter until my knuckles ached. Molly took a step closer, reaching out with a trembling hand. Thomas, I'm so sorry. For everything. I didn't know how to tell you. The words I wanted to say, accusations, blame, the poison of betrayal, all dissipated like smoke. Instead, I turned and met her eyes, searching for something that felt real. All I found was fear, and it mirrored my own. I don't know what to do, I whispered. Neither do I, she replied, voice cracking. And then, as if breaking the barrier that had held us apart, she leaned into me, her forehead resting against my chest. We stood there, clinging to each other as the water in the sink overflowed, a forgotten faucet mirroring our unraveling. The days that followed blurred into a restless limbo. Molly waited for the call that would deliver her fate, and I sat beside her in that waiting, suspended between hate and a love that refused to die, no matter how wounded. The phone call came on a Tuesday, the air thick with late spring humidity. Molly picked up the receiver with shaking hands, and I watched as her expression crumpled into something that looked like defeat. She set the phone down, eyes wide and empty. It's positive, she said, her voice barely a whisper. And just like that, everything shifted. The weeks that followed were a cruel dance between doctors' visits and paperwork, as we braced for the slow march of ALS. The betrayal faded into the background, no longer the story's heart, but just a footnote in the tragedy we now shared. Each day, I watched the woman I loved slip away, piece by piece, and with her, my anger crumbled into something I didn't recognize, grief, forgiveness, and an ache that would stay long after she was gone. And when the day came when she could no longer speak, when all that was left were her eyes, still seeking mine, I took her hand in mine. We said nothing, words had never failed so completely. But in that silence, I felt it, love, ruined and whole at once, as fleeting as breath.